A couple months ago, I talked about my wish list for the Nikon Z8, and now I have one in my hands, and let's find out how close it got to living up to those wishes. When I talked about the Nikon Z8 a few months ago, I really hit hard on the fact that I thought it would be a follow-up to the Nikon D850. Their last, well, not their last, but their last great DSLR. I think people kind of look at the D850 as the king of DSLRs, and honestly, Nikon a little bit at its pinnacle in sales and popularity and just in general. And I think that with the Z mount, they kind of had to claw their way back. And with the Z8 here, I feel like they've taken a big step forward. I don't think it's without problems, and it's kind of an interesting, like, how you look at it camera, because like in a lot of ways, it's not a whole lot different than the Canon R5, which is almost exactly 3 years old, but it has some major features that really stand out. It has a stacked sensor, which I actually talked about in that video, hoping that it didn't have. And you know what, now that I have it, I am glad it's in here. I mean, essentially, this camera is, as has been talked about all over the internet, a baby Z9. So they didn't exactly undercut the Z9, but the major differences between this camera and the Z9 are all honestly camera design and ergonomics. It doesn't have the grip. It has 2 USB-C ports. It has like little exterior things instead of having, of course, like an Ethernet port on the Z9. It's like exterior things, but internally, it's largely the same camera as the Nikon Z9, which, you know, it's not completely unprecedented by Nikon. I think that the, I think it would have been like the D4 or so, and the D700. I think when the D700 hit, a lot of people felt like it was almost the same, but you know, same everything. And you know, that's a lot of what has been discussed about this camera. But if you look at like the main features that it brings, you know, it's not dissimilar from the Canon R5 and the Sony A1. It's a lot cheaper than the A1. And to me, the A1 it really looks overpriced and long in the tooth in comparison, even though they're pretty much the same camera. This comes in $2,500 cheaper, and that's a big deal. Plus, you could argue that video feature-wise, it's significantly more feature-rich than the A1. As far as stills go, the A1 still has 30 frames a second in RAW, and this doesn't. But you know, I guess, you know, I don't know how much of an impact. I don't know how many people are using the 30 frames a second, especially since the RAW format on the A1 is kind of a very compressed RAW. So anyway, you know, if you look at it from one direction, you're like, okay, this camera is basically a slightly better R5, but really as far as capability goes, you know, it's very similar to the Canon R5, which is, you know, 3 years old. But then on the other hand, it's also extremely similar to the big flagship cameras, except between $2,500 and $1,500 cheaper. It's kind of the same level as the Canon R5, but you know, the fact that it has the stack sensor, shutterless design, great autofocus system, and honestly, really good ergonomics. And we can talk about the ergonomics for a second. I would say it's different. It's more than just a Nikon Z9 with a chopped off grip. I would say it has the DNA of a Z9, D850, and Z7 all kind of rolled into one. Like when you hold the grip and where the controls are, honestly, I feel it feels a little more like a beefier Z7 than like in my hands than like when I've held the Z7 II and Z7 than the Z9. The Z9 is just so distinctive with that big, huge grip, but it has a very deep nice grip, and the buttons are, but there is also something very D850 about it. It's hard to totally describe. You know, the big honkin' viewfinder on here is you know, one of those signatures. The buttons on the side, the mode, just like the controls, it just kind of feels like, and I used the D850 for a little while, and it kind of is a throwback to that. I think that Nikon was looking for a lot of people who have been holding out with D850s, because there's a lot of those. I mean, we have talked to them. Toby and I have talked to a lot of people who own D850s and are like, yeah, I'm just waiting for the mirrorless D850. Well, that's really what you have here. It feels like it looks like it has the same megapixels. It's not the same sensor as the D850, but it's the same megapixels. The autofocus has, you know, the state-of-the-art Z9 level autofocus system, and you have really great video. And the D850 had decent video for the time. I mean, it was one of the first full frame cameras to have full frame 4K, which, you know, people talk about Nikon just getting new to the video game. At that time, it was one of the only games in town to get full frame 4K. So, you know, but that was clear back in 2016 now. So how did it stack up to my wish list? Well, I would have loved for this to be a 61 megapixel camera, to be honest. You know, that little bump in megapixels would have been really nice for my work in particular. I definitely see where Nikon's coming from, but it really does join a whole lot of other 45 megapixel cameras, you know, in both Canon and Nikon's lineup, and Sony's. I mean, honestly, Sony, a lot of people shoot A7R3s and A7R2s, so there's a lot of 45 megapixel cameras out there. Would I have liked to have been 61? Yes. I think the big thing that it lived up to, though, with in my wish list is that it has all of the video features of the Z9, and that's really what Nikon needed to do here. Is there needed to be a less expensive, it's still expensive, but less expensive camera that had the video chops to really get Nikon going in that video market. Ultimately, that's going to be, I think a lot of videographers are paying attention, because, you know, another little factor is that Nikon essentially won their lawsuit with Red to have compressed RAW video in their cameras, record internal, and they're kind of the only game in town that is able to do that, at least right now, true compressed RAW video. So I think, you know, as from a videographer perspective, there's a lot of people looking at Nikon and being like, okay, you are really, they're bringing their A game. I would love to see them do more full-on video-centric body, but this is so full-featured for video, like it's hard to imagine really what that would look like other than like just a different ergonomics, honestly. It has 8K, 8K60, 4K 120, all the bit rates and, you know, log profiles that you could ever want. So it's a great video camera, so I love that they brought that. I also talked about ergonomics, and I'm mostly very happy with the ergonomics. They didn't do the dial on the side, and so I'm kind of adjusting. I'm not quite sure why they didn't do the dial, because I use that a lot on my Z9, but they didn't do that. And then there is like a couple of little things, like the AF on button is not very prominent, so it just doesn't stand out as much as the Z9. It's kind of funny, but generally speaking, ergonomics, they kind of nailed exactly what I was looking for them to do. They don't have a lock on the card door, and I've complained about that a lot with my Z7 and Z7 II, that I would open up my bag and it would be sitting there open. I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem here. It doesn't have the little bump here so that it catches onto as much stuff, so it's kind of flat, but I maybe would have preferred that. I would have been maybe a little bit poor peace of mind. The battery situation. So it has same old, let me see, ENEL15C, Z7, Z7 II, Z6, Z6 II. It's very similar form factor. I wanted a whole new battery, and you know, I'm still a little disappointed. The battery life in this isn't bad from all reports, and honestly, in my little bit of use, it's not been bad. but I do feel like that, like a complete redesign, like something like in the Sony cameras, because the A1 has a battery life that's not far off from the Z9, and it's a much smaller little battery. And the A7R5, you know, all those Sony cameras use that newly designed battery. Part of me thinks that this would have been a good opportunity for Nikon to do that, but like, I understand these batteries are everywhere. It was easy to get spare batteries for it, so you know, that was nice. So something I'm excited about with the Z8 is and something I wasn't really thinking about when I made that other video, is that I have power of the Z9 in a smaller, lighter body. And that when I made my Z9 review, which you should watch, we put a lot of work into that review, and it's really good. But in that review, I talked about that the grip on the Z9 was kind of a love-hate thing for me. I loved it when I was holding it, but hauling it around and fitting it into all the bags I need to fit it into was kind of tricky, honestly, sometimes. And this takes care of that. Like, I will be able to pack this in any backpack for any photography mission I want to do. And you know, for some of the bigger climbs and hikes that we want to do, it just is nice to have that. I have basically everything I have in the Z9 right here. It has the screen that I love. Now, people are disappointed it doesn't flip. I'm not disappointed it doesn't flip, because this back screen configuration is the pinnacle to me. The way that it flips up in portrait as well as in landscapes. You know, it's my favorite, and I like Nikon screens. I like how you interact with them, so that's just really nice. It even has the light up buttons and the sensor shield, which I am tempted to show you right now, but since we're outside, I'm not gonna tempt that kind of fate. But it does have the sensor shield. So I have everything I have with the Z9 pretty much, except for the grip. And supposedly the weather sealing isn't quite the Z9 level, but it's D850 level. And I know a lot of people took D850s to a lot of extreme places and they held up great. So I'm excited about that. That kind of wraps my, I guess you'd call this a first impression video of the Nikon Z8. There's gonna be a lot more Z8 content to come on this channel. I'm gonna be using this camera for a lot of different projects, and I hope to eventually do a much bigger scale review like I did with the Z9. And I'm really excited to take along these two bigger and smaller brothers on lots of adventures. So I hope you will like this video, subscribe to the channel if that interests you or intrigues you at all. And with that, we'll see you on the next adventure.